In the monumental, transformative year of 1860, the city of Melbourne, the vibrant capital of the Australian colony of Victoria, was riding the absolute crest of an unprecedented, world-altering economic boom. Fueled entirely by the massive, highly lucrative discoveries of the Victorian gold rush, the city was literally awash in unfathomable wealth. Grand, imposing stone edifices were rapidly replacing humble wooden structures, and the fiercely ambitious colonial elite harbored an intense, burning desire for not merely financial supremacy, but profound intellectual and geographical glory. At this time, the vast, punishing interior of the Australian continent remained a terrifying, completely unexplored blank space on European maps, a deadly, highly mysterious region ominously referred to as the Dead Heart. A fierce, deeply entrenched rivalry existed between the wealthy colony of Victoria and its poorer neighbour, South Australia. When the South Australian government publicly offered a massive, highly publicised financial reward for the very first expedition to successfully cross the brutal continent from the southern coast to the Northern Ocean, the leaders of Victoria were intensely provoked. Driven by profound civic pride, boundless colonial ambition, and seemingly limitless financial resources, the Philosophical Institute of Victoria resolved to organise the grandest, most expensive, and most heavily equipped exploratory mission in the entire history of the continent, the Victorian Exploring Expedition. However, the monumental endeavour was fatally compromised from the very beginning by a series of disastrous, deeply illogical personnel decisions. Rather than selecting a seasoned, hardened bushman or an experienced explorer who possessed a deep, practical understanding of indigenous survival techniques and the unforgiving nature of the Australian outback, the organising committee inexplicably appointed Robert O'Hara Burke as the supreme leader. Burke was a charismatic, highly courageous, and deeply imposing Irish-born police inspector and former military officer. While he possessed undeniable physical bravery, he had absolutely no experience in wilderness navigation, possessed absolutely no bushcraft skills, and was notorious for his highly impulsive, fiercely impatient, and deeply stubborn temperament. To balance Burke's volatile nature, the committee appointed William John Wills as his second-in-command. Wills was a brilliant, meticulous, and deeply analytical young scientist, astronomer, and surveyor. He was highly proficient with complex navigational instruments, but he possessed a profoundly shy, deferential personality, making him entirely incapable of challenging or contradicting the increasingly erratic and disastrous decisions of his authoritarian commander. This fundamentally mismatched duo was tasked with leading a gargantuan, heavily burdened caravan that bordered on the absurd. The expedition had spent a fortune importing over 24 camels directly from India, complete with specialized handlers, firmly believing these exotic beasts of burden were the absolute key to conquering the desert. Alongside the camels were dozens of horses, several massive, heavy wooden wagons, and a staggering 20 tons of supplies. The logistical planning was so fundamentally flawed that the cargo included a heavy oak camp table, luxurious chairs, fine Chinese porcelain, dozens of gallons of rum, bizarrely intended to reinvigorate tired camels, and over 1,500 pounds of sugar. When the massive, highly theatrical expedition finally departed from Royal Park in Melbourne on August 20, 1860, it was treated as a grand, triumphant public spectacle. A staggering crowd of over 15,000 cheering citizens gathered to bid farewell to their colonial heroes, creating an atmosphere of absolute, unquestioning optimism. But the very moment this lumbering, top-heavy caravan breached the limits of civilization, the harsh, unforgiving realities of the Australian landscape violently asserted themselves. The massive, overloaded wagons immediately sank to their axles in the deep, clinging mud left by the heavy winter rains. The imported camels violently terrified the horses, causing constant chaos and broken harnesses, and the overall pace of the expedition was catastrophically, agonizingly slow, often covering a mere 2 or 3 miles in a grueling day. Burke, increasingly consumed by a dark, gnawing paranoia that the rival South Australian expedition led by the highly experienced explorer John McDouall Stewart might actually beat him to the northern coast, began to make a series of highly erratic, panicked decisions. Before even reaching the Darling River, he began frantically abandoning highly expensive, vital equipment by the side of the muddy trail just to slightly lighten the immense load. Upon finally reaching the remote, isolated frontier outpost of Menindee, Burke made his first truly fatal, catastrophic strategic error. Instead of patiently maintaining the integrity of his massive convoy, he violently fractured the expedition. He took the strongest men, the healthiest camels, and the fastest horses, and aggressively pushed forward, explicitly ordering the remaining men, encumbered with the heavy, slow-moving supply wagons, to wait in Menindee until he could locate a safe path to Cooper Creek, a vital, temporary oasis system situated on the very edge of the deadly, waterless desert. This highly impulsive, entirely illogical division of vital resources and manpower laid the absolute, unshakable foundation for the impending tragedy, as Burke knowingly marched into the unforgiving heart of the continent while leaving his crucial lifeline completely severed behind him. Upon finally reaching the relative sanctuary of Cooper Creek, an isolated, temporary oasis of waterholes and ancient eucalyptus trees situated on the very precipice of the terrifying stony desert, Burke's fatal impatience once again entirely consumed his judgment. Instead of responsibly waiting for the critical arrival of the heavily laden supply wagons that he had deliberately left behind in Menindee, he made a radical, incredibly reckless, and ultimately catastrophic tactical decision. In the absolute, blistering height of the brutal Australian summer in mid-December 1860, when temperatures in the Outback frequently soared to a lethal, suffocating extreme, Burke resolved to execute a rapid, forcefully accelerated dash directly to the Gulf of Carpentaria on the northern coast. He ruthlessly pared down his team, selecting only 3 men to accompany him, the meticulous scientist William Wills, and 2 loyal but inexperienced men, John King and Charles Gray. They departed with a dangerously minimal contingent of 6 camels, a single horse, and an incredibly meager supply of rations meticulously calculated to last a mere 3 months. They were recklessly attempting to traverse over 1,500 kilometers of absolutely unmapped, violently hostile territory, both to the coast and back. Before departing, Burke established a temporary depot at Cooper Creek, leaving a man named William Bray in charge of a small holding party. Burke issued strict, unwavering verbal orders. Bray was to wait at the Cooper Creek depot for exactly 13 weeks, a period of 3 months, for the advance party to return from the Gulf. Burke's overwhelming arrogance was so absolute that he entirely refused to even entertain the grim possibility that their perilous journey might be significantly delayed by impassable swamps, crippling disease, or sheer, debilitating physical exhaustion. The grueling, relentless push northward rapidly evolved into an agonizing ordeal that severely tested the absolute limits of human endurance. The 4 isolated men were forced to traverse an incredibly diverse and continuously hostile array of unforgiving landscapes, violently transitioning from the blinding, sun-baked plains of the stony deserts to dense, heavily thorned scrublands that tore relentlessly at their flesh and clothing. As they finally, agonizingly approached the northern coast in early February 1861, the environmental conditions shifted with violent, terrifying suddenness. They had unknowingly walked directly into the brutal, oppressive tropical monsoon season. The previously dry, cracked earth instantly transformed into a bottomless, clinging, and entirely impassable quagmire. The heavy, wide-footed camels, which were biologically adapted for dry, sandy deserts, were completely useless in the deep, sucking mud, constantly slipping, falling, and groaning in profound physical exhaustion. After weeks of unparalleled suffering, they finally reached the dense, suffocating mangrove swamps situated at the tidal estuary of the Flinders River. From a purely geographical and technical standpoint, they had successfully achieved the impossible. They had crossed the Australian continent from south to north. They could physically taste the heavy salt in the humid, stagnant air and notice the tidal shifts in the muddy river, but due to the impenetrable, highly toxic wall of dense tropical jungle and deep, treacherous swampland, they were entirely unable to actually lay eyes upon the open ocean. Their monumental, historic victory was profoundly bitter, entirely anticlimactic, and deeply, physically exhausting. The immediate realization of their dire situation quickly overshadowed their geographic triumph. They now faced a terrifying, agonizing return journey, and their vital food supplies were already dangerously depleted. The march back southward rapidly degenerated into an absolute, unmitigated nightmare of starvation and profound physical decay. It became a desperate, losing race against time, punishing weather, and complete bodily collapse. They were forced to violently abandon almost all of their remaining equipment, eventually slaughtering their only horse and several of their beloved camels just to acquire enough tough, stringy meat to stay alive. The intense, suffocating psychological strain within the small, isolated group reached a critical, highly toxic breaking point. Burke, heavily consumed by paranoia and starvation, openly accused Charles Gray of stealing a tiny, precious portion of the remaining flour, viciously beating the severely weakened man in a fit of rage. Gray was suffering profoundly from the agonizing effects of dysentery, but Burke stubbornly and cruelly dismissed his suffering as mere malingering. Ultimately, Gray's devastated body completely failed him. He collapsed and died in the harsh dirt from absolute, total physical exhaustion and severe malnutrition. The remaining 3 men, severely weakened by advanced scurvy and hovering on the very brink of death, were forced to expend a full, agonizing day, expending energy they desperately could not afford to lose, to dig a shallow, rocky grave for their fallen comrade in the concrete hard earth. Dressed in literal, rotting rags, half dead from profound starvation, Burke, Wills, and King continued to drag their decaying bodies southward. Every single ounce of their fading willpower was entirely fixated on one singular, desperate hope: reaching the safety of the Cooper Creek depot, where they firmly believed William Bray was waiting with fresh, abundant provisions, safety, and salvation. The date of April 21, 1861, is permanently and painfully etched into the annals of Australian history as the absolute epicenter of a heartbreaking, profoundly tragic series of fatal coincidences and missed opportunities. On that fateful morning at the Cooper Creek depot, William Bray found himself facing an agonizing, entirely unenviable command decision. He had faithfully and stubbornly waited at the isolated outpost for an incredible 18 weeks, a full 5 weeks longer than the strict 3-month deadline Burke had originally imposed upon him. The men under Bray's command were now severely afflicted with the crippling, painful symptoms of scurvy, their own vital supplies were rapidly dwindling, and the overwhelming, undeniable consensus among the holding party was that Burke and his men had undoubtedly perished somewhere in the unforgiving northern deserts. At exactly 11 a.m., heavy with guilt but believing he had no other logical choice to save his own men, Bray ordered the camp to be broken. Before departing, he carefully buried a sturdy wooden chest containing a small, vital cache of dried meat, flour, and sugar directly beneath the sprawling, heavy branches of a massive, ancient eucalyptus tree. Using a heavy axe, he deeply and prominently carved the word "dig" into the thick bark, along with the date, creating a highly visible marker. With the cache secured, Bray and his sick men slowly departed, beginning the long, arduous trek south toward Menindee. Exactly 9 hours later, in the fading, blood-red light of the evening sun, 3 emaciated, barely recognizable human skeletons stumbled into the clearing. Burke, Wills, and King, propped up by their 2 remaining, desperately weakened camels, had finally achieved the impossible and reached the depot. Instead of the joyous, tearful reunion they had hallucinated for weeks, they were met with an absolute, crushing, and completely devastating silence. Spotting the freshly carved letters on the massive tree, they frantically dug up the chest and discovered Bray's note, which brutally informed them that their salvation had departed a mere 9 hours prior. Fully aware that Bray's party had only a 9-hour head start, the most logical, strategically sound decision would have been to immediately consume the fresh provisions and forcefully march south along the known, established trail to catch the slow-moving, encumbered holding party. However, in this critical moment, Burke made his final, absolutely fatal, and profoundly arrogant command decision. Firmly believing that his men and their dying camels were far too physically devastated to successfully overtake Bray's fresh horses, he stubbornly refused to retrace their established path. Instead, he forced a radical, completely disastrous alternative plan. They would head southwest, blindly following the meandering, unreliable waterholes of Cooper Creek, desperately hoping to miraculously stumble upon a remote pastoral police outpost at Mount Hopeless. It was a catastrophic, completely unresearched gamble. Before abandoning the dig tree, they placed a letter outlining their new, doomed route inside the buried chest, but they committed a fatal, unforgivable oversight. They failed to alter the prominent carved markings on the tree. When Bray, plagued by lingering guilt, actually rode back to the depot a few weeks later to check for survivors, the undisturbed appearance of the campsite led him to mistakenly believe the buried cache remained untouched, completely sealing the explorer's tragic fate. Setting out toward Mount Hopeless, the 3 men quickly found themselves entirely trapped in a merciless, barren landscape. Their last 2 camels quickly perished in the mud, and their physical strength completely evaporated. In their absolute darkest, most desperate hour, they encountered a group of indigenous Australians from the local Yandrawanda tribe. Recognizing the profound suffering of the white explorers, the Yandrawanda exhibited incredible, life-saving compassion, offering them freshly caught fish and a thick, sustaining paste created from the spores of the Nadu fern. However, Burke, profoundly blinded by his deeply ingrained colonial arrogance and an irrational, lingering fear of the indigenous population, frequently and aggressively drove their saviors away, firing his heavy service revolver to intimidate them. Left entirely to their own inadequate devices, the 3 starving men desperately attempted to sustain themselves purely on the Nadu seeds they managed to gather. They meticulously pounded the hard seeds between stones and consumed massive quantities of the resulting paste, desperately trying to fill their aching stomachs. But they were completely, tragically ignorant of a highly critical, ancient Aboriginal culinary secret. Raw Nadu contains high levels of thiaminase, a destructive enzyme that completely violently breaks down vitamin B1 in the human body if the seeds are not properly roasted and heavily diluted with water first. Burke and Wills were eating constantly, their stomachs physically full, but they were literally starving to death on a cellular level, suffering from the horrific, agonizing ravages of beriberi. By the end of June 1861, completely paralyzed by weakness, the brilliant scientist William Wills quietly requested to be left alone in a crude brush shelter with a small supply of nardoo and water, urging Burke and King to press on and desperately search for the Yandrawanda. A few days later, Robert O'Hara Burke, the fiercely proud, fatally flawed commander, died in the dirt, stubbornly clutching his loaded revolver. Wills perished completely alone in his shelter, meticulously recording his fading pulse in his journal until the very end. Only John King, who completely surrendered his pride, deeply humbled himself, and was eventually taken in by the compassionate Yandrawanda people, managed to barely survive until a rescue party led by Alfred Howitt finally discovered him months later. The expedition was a colossal, highly expensive failure, leaving behind a profound national trauma and a grim, enduring monument to the devastating consequences of colonial hubris in the face of the ancient, unforgiving Australian landscape.